right, Lab 8 is on the nervous system. This is the lecture for Lab 8. For those of you who have the lab manual, some changes. We're going to say posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, and anterior funiculus. This matches what's in the textbook. Scratch out the word columns. All right, the neuron. The neuron is a cell, important for the nervous system. It has three main regions or structures. You have the dendrites. These are short little processes that connect to the cell body. Dendrites send signal toward the cell body. Then the cell body is the nucleus and other important structures for the function of the cell. And then coming off the cell body is a long process called the axon. And the action potential, that nerve impulse, travels along the axon. Here is our neuron model. So here is the cell body. There's the nucleus of the cell body where it starts to form the axon. That little cone area is called the axon hillock, then leads to the axon. These little beige stumps, these are the dendrites. So the beige stumps are the dendrites. These sort of orangish structures, these are synaptic knobs coming from other neurons. So other neurons' axons end in synaptic knobs, making contact with the dendrites and cell body of the model. And where the synaptic knob and the dendrite come together, that is the synapse. Here's the rest of the model. So the axon continues along the model. So here's the axon straight down the center. Surrounding the axon, of course, is the myelin sheath. So these many layers represent the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath is formed by a specific cell, the Schwann cell. So this here represents the nucleus of the Schwann cell. Yes, I want nucleus of Schwann cell. Finally, the little gaps between the myelination is called the nodes of Ranvier. So node of Ranvier, node of Ranvier. All right, the spinal cord. Spinal cord is the inferior structure coming off of the brain. It exists as soon as nervous tissue passes through the foramen magnum of the skull, and then it travels along the vertebral canal down to about the level of the L1, L2 vertebra. So the spinal cord does not travel the full length of the vertebral column or vertebral canal. It ends at around L1, L2. Here is our model of the spinal cord. So this would be the spinal cord. This is the transverse section. Here is the structures coming off of it to form spinal nerves. So in the very center of the spinal cord is the little hole or space traveling the length of the spinal cord. That is the central canal filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Coming off the front of the spinal cord is the ventral root. Coming off the back of the spinal cord is the dorsal root. This lump here is the dorsal root ganglion. And so the dorsal root and the ventral root will come together to form the spinal nerve. So spinal nerve, dorsal root ganglion, back of the posterior side of the spinal cord, spinal nerve, ventral root, anterior side of the spinal cord. The different regions of the white matter in the spinal cord are called posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, and anterior funiculus. So the white matter is broken up into three pieces per side: posterior funiculus, lateral funiculus, anterior funiculus. The gray matter gets broken up into four pieces per side. So we have the posterior horn, the lateral horn, and the anterior horn. And then the bar going across the two sides of the spinal cord, that is the gray commissure. In the gray commissure, you'll find the central canal. Again, posterior horn, lateral horn, anterior horn, gray commissure. Here's the brain. Brain is nice and wrinkly looking. The brain has lying on it directly one of the three meninges, specifically the pia mater. So the pia mater, very thin, transparent structure, surrounds the brain, and you can see helps to hold blood vessels in place and so forth. You can remove it. I wouldn't. It takes a very long time. All right, all the humps coming up, all these ridges are called gyri. So you have One of these would be a gyrus, many gyri. So those are the folds coming up. And then the crevices going down, these shallow grooves, are called sulci. So many sulci, but just one of them would be a sulcus. So sulcus going down, gyrus going up, hills and valleys. The hills are the gyrus, the valleys is the sulcus. Here is the lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus is a big sulcus on the lateral side. There are two of them, of course, right and left. The transverse fissure is the space between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So there's the transverse fissure. The longitudinal fissure is the space between the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. Each hemisphere of the cerebrum has 5 lobes. 4 of these lobes are on the surface. One of them is deep, and you have to cut tissue away to get to it. The superficial lobes include the frontal lobe, that's anterior, that's where we get thinking, motor control, personality. Parietal lobe, which is more superior, where our cutaneous sensations go. The occipital lobe, posterior, it is where our primary area for vision is. The temporal lobe, on the lateral sides, sort of near the ears, signals for olfaction or smell, and also hearing go to the temporal lobes. The insula is the 5th lobe. It is found deep inside the lateral sulcus, and it's involved in gustation. So again, 5 lobes. All right, this is a mid-sagittal view of the brain. So there's the cerebrum up here. Down here's the brainstem. This is the diencephalon. We see this here, this big ridge of white tissue here. That is corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is what connects the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. This wall here is septum pellucidum. Septum pellucidum separates the right and left lateral ventricles. This area here is the diencephalon, which includes the hypothalamus, or the beak of the seahorse, and also the thalamus, or the main head area of the seahorse. This right here, this little point here, is the optic chiasm. Optic chiasm is where the right and left optic nerves come together and fuse briefly. So again, mid-sagittal view. Here's the seahorse, the head of the seahorse being the diencephalon, made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Down here, all of this is the brain stem. The brain stem gets broken into 3 pieces. We have the midbrain, or neck of the seahorse. Midbrain includes these bumps called the corpora quadrigemina. In the middle, or belly of the seahorse, is the pons. Tail of the seahorse is the medulla oblongata. So midbrain, superior, pons, middle, medulla oblongata inferior, and then the medulla oblongata turns into the spinal cord when it passes the foramen magnum. There's also some spaces here, cerebral spinal fluid. This channel here is the cerebral aqueduct. The space here is the 4th ventricle. Technically, 3rd ventricle is up here, and cerebral spinal fluid moves from the 3rd ventricle down the cerebral aqueduct to the 4th ventricle, and then from there down into the central canal or around the brain. Cerebellum. This structure is the cerebellum. Big wrinkly structure. Here again, cerebellum. It has 2 hemispheres as well. This is an inferior view of the brain, so we're looking up at the brain. So up here is the frontal lobe. Lying on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, we have the olfactory bulb. Olfactory bulb, important for the sense of smell. These stumps here and here are the optic nerves. We can't see the optic chiasm because the pituitary gland is in the way. This pituitary gland is in the way of the optic chiasm. But after the optic nerves form the optic chiasm, after that they stretch out as the optic tracts. Optic tracts are within the brain officially. And again, this is the pons, belly of the seahorse. Here is the medulla oblongata. Again, the mid-sagittal view of the brain. This includes most of the stuff you need to know for the mid-sagittal view. Covered all of them pretty much already, but here's a good all of them together sort of view. All right, there are spaces in the brain. These spaces are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. There is the right and left lateral ventricles found within one each in each hemisphere of the cerebrum, so right and left lateral ventricles. They connect to the third ventricle, which is in the area of the diencephalon, and that connects via the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle, which is between the cerebellum and the brainstem. Reflexes. Reflexes are automatic responses to stimuli. They do not require us to do any deep thinking about them. They happen automatically. Spinal reflexes do not even require the brain. They will cause the motion to happen even if the brain isn't connected to the spinal cord. So 2 examples: patellar reflex, when a doctor hits your patellar ligament of your knee, and also say you touch something hot. That's the withdrawal reflex. So patellar reflex, very simple, monosynaptic. You have 2 neurons needed. That's it. Only one synapse from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Monosynaptic, one synapse. So doctor hits the patellar ligament, boom. The signal of the stretch goes to the sensory neuron that carries the information to the spinal cord. It will then synapse with the motor neuron that will then send out a signal to the muscle to cause it to contract and for you to kick your leg. 2 neurons and an effector. No brain needed. If you wanted to talk about reflexes and reflex arcs in general, there would be 5 total possible components. So you'd have the sensory receptor that detects the sensation, sensory neuron carrying it to the central nervous system. 1 or more interneurons within the central nervous system then connect to a motor neuron that sends the command out to the effector, which is usually a muscle. So, for instance, with the withdrawal reflex, you step on attack. Turns out the sensory receptor and the sensory neuron are the same thing. So that sensory neuron carries the stimulus of pain to the spinal cord. It then synapses with an interneuron that's then going to synapse with the motor neuron, and the motor neuron will then send the command to the proper muscles so that you move away from the source of the pain. You withdraw away from it. So again, sensory receptor, sensory neuron, 1 or more interneurons, motor neuron, and the effector. Sensory neuron and sensory receptor can be the same structure, and as we know with the patellar reflex, you don't always need an interneuron. And of course, it can get more complicated because really, if you're walking along barefoot and you step on a tack, you not only need to contract the muscles to raise your leg away from the pain source of your pain, but you're probably going to jump back a little bit, so you need the muscles for that jumping back to be working properly so that you don't fall, because that would hurt. So as you can see, sensory neuron carries the information to the interneuron. Interneuron can synapse with multiple neurons, can send also information up to the brain, because obviously the brain's going to find out about what happened. It just wasn't involved in the motion. All right, hope you enjoyed that lecture.